On July 18, 2023, 71-year-old Steve Curry set out to hike the Golden Canyon Trail in Death Valley National Park, a place known worldwide for its scorching summer temperatures. Despite his age and the dangers of the desert heat, he pressed on. But tragically, he would never leave Death Valley alive. This is the story of Steve Curry's first and last hike in the hottest place on Earth. Steve Curry was born on August 28, 1951 in San Diego, California. Much of his childhood was spent moving from state to state following his father's military career. In adulthood, he built a steady life for himself. He worked for the Los Angeles School District and later as an electrician, a career he would stick with until retirement. In the 1990s, Steve met his future wife Rima and the two were married in 1994. Not long after settling into married life, Steve developed a new and unexpected passion for the outdoors. Almost suddenly, he began collecting camping gear, training in rock climbing, and even completing wilderness survival courses. When his schedule kept him from traveling far, Steve made do by hiking Mount Lukens just north of Los Angeles, where the city skylines could still be seen in the distance. Other times when he wanted the feeling of camping but couldn't get away, he would pitch his tent in the backyard and spent the night there enjoying the quiet sky above. His love for the outdoors was matched only by the love he had for his wife, though Rima didn't always share his enthusiasm for wilderness adventures. Still, she joined him on some of his outings, even if she didn't feel the same pull toward the outdoors as Steve did. Friends and fellow hikers often describe him as cheerful, easygoing, and quick to make others laugh. His friendly personality earned him many lasting connections within the hiking community. In the weeks leading up to July 18, Steve began telling Rima that he wanted to hike in Death Valley. For him, it was an item on a personal list of challenges to accomplish as an experienced outdoorsman. But he knew that convincing her wouldn't be easy. She worried about the extreme heat that Death Valley was notorious for, and at his age, she felt the risks were even greater. Steve, however, was persistent. He decided not to push the conversation further. Instead, he kept his plan to himself. In the early hours of July 18, he quietly left home, driving 4 hours from Los Angeles to Death Valley. Rima knew well how determined he could be when it came to outdoor adventures, so she assumed he would eventually attempt it, so she expected him home by nightfall. Death Valley has always carried a reputation as one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. On July 10, 1913, the hottest temperature ever recorded on the planet was 134 degrees Fahrenheit or 56.7 degrees Celsius and was measured at Furnace Creek inside Death Valley. More than a century later, it still holds that record. Since becoming a national park, Death Valley has logged countless summer days where the thermometer has soared above 120 degrees Fahrenheit or 49 degrees Celsius. It is not a place for the unprepared or inexperienced. Over the years, many lives have been lost to the heat and desolation. Only weeks before Steve's trip, another man in his 60s died after his car broke down in 126-degree weather with both flat tires and a failed air conditioner, leaving him stranded. And yet, despite the risks, Death Valley continues to attract more than 1 million visitors each year. The appeal lies in its striking scenery. Endless salt flats shimmering like glass under the sun, multicolored badlands carved into dramatic ridges, and towering sand dunes that glow golden in sunrise and sunset. The land has an almost otherworldly beauty, a quality that draws visitors from around the globe. For Steve, the allure was powerful enough to outweigh the dangers. He wanted to see Death Valley for himself on foot. Steve arrived at Golden Canyon around 8 in the morning. At the trailhead stood a warning sign advising visitors not to hike after 10 a.m., when the desert heat often reaches its most extreme levels. Early mornings, especially before sunrise, are considered the safest times for a hike, and they reward hikers with views of the sun rising over the barren ridges. By starting at 8, Steve was still within the recommended hours, and with decades of hiking experience, he likely felt confident. He came prepared with the basics: proper hiking clothes, a sun hat, water for hydration, and sunscreen spread across his face and arms for protection. Standing at the entrance, he would have seen the warning signs, but his passion and planning pushed him forward. He was no stranger to heat, having hiked in the hot weather before, But Death Valley was different. Even in the early morning, the air felt overwhelming. The sensation was like walking inside a vast oven, where even the occasional breeze came across more like the blast of a blow dryer than a cooling wind. Still, Steve was determined. He had been preparing for this for weeks, and to him it was not just another hike, but a personal goal. His plan was to complete the full loop, starting at Golden Canyon Trail, linking it with the Badlands Loop, stopping to rest at Zabriskie Point, and then returning by way of Gower Gulch back into Golden Canyon. For a healthy adult, the loop usually takes around 4 to 4.5 hours, but for Steve, it would have been a bit longer. From the moment he stepped onto the trail, Steve was met with the punishing heat that gives Death Valley its reputation. By that hour, temperatures had already reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius. Younger and faster hikers passed him along the way, their pace quicker than his own. Steve may have felt a sense of urgency to keep up, pushing himself harder against the heat. At the same time, he wouldn't have ignored the scenery around him. Even in the sweltering air, the sight of jagged ridges and the changing colors of the rocks was captivating. After 2 hours on the trail, he reached Zabriskie Point, his first planned stop at around 10 a.m. At the same time Steve was making his way along the trail, 2 people from the Los Angeles Times were also at Zabriskie Point. Journalist Haley Smith and photojournalist Francine Orr had traveled there that morning to interview visitors about their experiences in Death Valley. As they observed the lookout, they noticed an older man climbing the path. He stood out immediately, clearly older than most of the other hikers that day, moving at a slower pace, yet not deterred by the heat. Step by step, he worked his way upward with determination, matching the resolve of hikers half his age. When Steve finally reached the top, he was visibly exhausted. The sun was relentless, and the temperature was already rising into dangerous territory. He walked toward one of the only places offering a sliver of relief, the shadow cast beneath the metal information sign. He lowered himself into the shade, catching his breath. Haley approached him while Francine raised her camera. At that moment, Francine captured a photograph of Steve, his face coated in thick layer of sunscreen to protect against the desert sun. As Haley began to talk to him, Steve opened up. He told him about his life, his family, and his passion for the outdoors. He explained that visiting Death Valley had been a dream of his, something he wanted to accomplish for a long time. Hiking there was, for him, a personal milestone. Yet, as their conversation continued, Steve admitted that he had not come fully prepared for the environment. To their surprise, he revealed that he had brought only a single 1 liter of water. For Death Valley, in the middle of July, this was far from adequate. Haley and Francine could clearly see the toll the heat was taking on him. His movements were slow, his words carried the weight of fatigue, and his body language showed signs of strain. They asked him directly why he had chosen to hike in such extreme conditions, especially given the park's reputation. Steve gave a simple answer: why not? It was less about dismissing the risk and more about his personal philosophy. If the outdoors offered a challenge, he was willing to face it. Out of concern, Haley and Francine offered him a chance to cool down. They suggested he sit inside their car with the air conditioning running, even offering to give him a ride back. Steve, however, declined. He reassured them that he was fine, though his flushed face and wary posture suggested otherwise. His biggest worry, he admitted, was falling behind the younger hikers on the trail. He didn't want to be the one left struggling in the desert while others pressed forward. After finishing their conversation, the reporters said their goodbyes. They returned to their vehicle and drove away, their minds lingering on the determined but vulnerable man they had just met. Steve, meanwhile, prepared to continue his hike. Back in Los Angeles, Rima wasn't immediately worried when Steve failed to come home that night. Her first reaction wasn't fear, but mild frustration. In her mind, Steve had probably taken off on another one of his spontaneous camping trips, something he had done before without warning. For years, she had often tried to make it harder for him to head off on adventures, knowing his drive sometimes outweighed caution. This time felt no different, and she assumed he would return after a short getaway. But as days passed, her assumptions began to crumble. On Thursday, 3 days after Steve had left, Rima found an envelope taped on her front door. Inside was a note from the coroner's office instructing her to call them as soon as possible. Confused, she picked up the phone. On the other end, she was told news she had never expected. Steve had died in Death Valley. The news hit her like a wave. In an instant, the frustration she had felt was replaced with shock and grief. Steve, who had spent decades living for the outdoors, was gone. It turned out Steve had completed the full hike back to Golden Canyon. The journey, even under ideal conditions, takes several hours. With only a liter of water and having refused additional water from the reporters, he had little left to sustain him in the brutal heat. As the hours wore on, Steve most likely began experiencing the early symptoms of hyperthermia. These can include excessive sweating, rapid breathing, dizziness, and a pulse that grows weak even as it races. Without enough fluids, the body cannot regulate its temperature, and the risk of collapse becomes imminent. On strenuous hikes, the body can lose half a liter to a full liter of water every single hour. At temperatures over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, sweat evaporates so quickly you might not even notice how much you're losing. Even 2 liters would be considered risky in those conditions. A 4-hour trek across the canyon floor could require 3 or 4 liters of water just to replace what the body loses. And water alone doesn't cover everything. Sweat also removes the salt from the body, and without electrolytes or salty foods, hikers can experience muscle cramps and, in severe cases, collapse. From Zabriskie Point, the hike back to Golden Canyon would have taken him roughly 3 hours. By then, the midday sun was directly overhead, and temperatures in the canyon floor were climbing close to 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 49 degrees Celsius. By the time Steve reached the end of the trail, his strength was nearly gone. He walked toward the restroom area near the Golden Canyon parking lot, likely seeking a cooler place to rest or recover. But before he could make it inside, he collapsed on the ground around 3:30 in the afternoon. Other hikers in the area saw him fall and rushed to his side. Emergency services were called immediately, but when paramedics arrived, there was little they could do. Despite their efforts, Steve could not be revived. The official cause of death was recorded as heat-related illness. At that exact time, the temperature at Golden Canyon was measured at 121 degrees Fahrenheit or 49 degrees Celsius. For those who knew him, Steve's passing was devastating. His friends in the hiking community remembered his humor, his friendliness, and the enthusiasm he carried into every outdoor adventure. To them, he was not just another hiker, but someone who brought joy and lightheartedness to long treks and difficult climbs. For Rima, the loss was deeply personal. She reflected on their life together, remembering the plans they had made for the future. "We were supposed to grow old together," she said. "Sit on our rocking chairs on the porch." That vision of a shared future was suddenly gone. Yet, amid her heartbreak, she found some measure of comfort in knowing that Steve's final moments were spent doing what he loved most. The outdoors had been his passion, his source of energy and joy, and it remained with him until the very end. That's it for the video. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. I would really appreciate it if you can support the channel so that one day I can offer you a much better experience. Have a good, wonderful day or night, and I will see you in the next video.